Some of the most trivial discussions I've ever heard are those revolving around the Zelda timeline. The conversation delves deep into the stories and history of the Zelda universe, but the discussion usually revolves around one topic. If every game in the series takes place within the same universe, what order do they go in? Back in the day, this was a pretty simple answer, but after 30 years, it's become so confusing that not even Nintendo can come up with the right answer. While I find the discussion to be pretty interesting, I also find it to be incredibly fucking pointless. None of these games ever required you to play previous entries to enjoy them, and the connections between each one are so loose that it might as well not even matter. At the end of the day, talking about the Zelda timeline has always been a giant excuse for ridiculous nerds to flaunt their own knowledge of the series. It was usually a conversation that I could brush off as petty nerd shit, but since Nintendo has released an official timeline for the Hyrule Historia, it's become pretty hard to avoid. So since I'm a huge fan of the series, I'm going to break down the Zelda timeline and talk about why it doesn't really matter. Before I even start, I just want to point out that this is some petty nerd shit. So while I might come off as an incredibly passionate, dickless nerd, I do have the self-awareness to realize just how pointless this whole discussion is. So there's the disclaimer. For those who aren't familiar with The Legend of Zelda, let's start off by talking about why this is even an issue. The series started on the NES with The Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. At this point in time, it's pretty clear that Zelda 2 is a direct sequel to Zelda 1. Now, this is where things get a little more complicated. Nintendo released the third game in the series, but instead of making another sequel, they called it The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. It featured the same gameplay as the first game in the series, but it also created its own story that seemed completely removed from the events of the previous games. You could argue that it was a prequel to The Legend of Zelda, but in reality, A Link to the Past is essentially The Legend of Zelda retold through a new lens. But these fucking nerds couldn't see it like that. After all, Zelda 2 is a sequel to Zelda 1, so A Link to the Past has to fit in somewhere. At this point in time, no one cared about the Zelda timeline. A majority of the fans didn't care. Nintendo wasn't thinking about the continuity of the series, but these fucking nerds were just holding on to this fan theory for the sake of having no dick. Nintendo started to release more Zelda games. In fact, they released a shit ton of Zelda games, and as more of these games made slight offhand references to previous games, the fan theories of the Zelda timeline were getting more and more ridiculous. Then all of a sudden, it's been 25 years. Nintendo suddenly decides to do something for its anniversary that would please the fans, so they released Skyward Sword along with an official timeline that ties the series together. So what's the big problem? I mean, first of all, what the fuck? But more importantly, why did they do this? I thought it was pretty clear that these games were never meant to connect like this. From the beginning, it always seemed like The Legend of Zelda was serialized in the same way as the Super Mario series. In the early days of the NES, all they really did was slap a number on each sequel. All they were trying to do was simply reap off of the success of the previous entries, and this is pretty easy to do since all these games are on the same system. This trend started to change once each series transitioned to the next generation of hardware. Instead of releasing the sequels as numerical titles, they simply gave each series a subtitle. I mean, you could call it Zelda 3 or Super Mario Bros. 4, but all it's going to do is alienate the players who never played the previous entries. It's really the best of both worlds. If you're a fan of the series, you already know that these will be brand new games, but if this is your first time, you can enjoy these new games without having to play the games prior. I mean, that's the whole benefit of a serial. Nintendo doesn't always have to come up with bold new ideas for every game. You can just have your reoccurring characters that can be placed in any situation, as a means to play through some new levels, tell a brand new story, and maybe explore some new gameplay mechanics. So what the fuck does this have to do with the Zelda timeline? Well, let me ask you this. If both series of games have been around for this long, with each series having this many sequels, why does no one give a fuck about the Super Mario timeline? The fans will complain for fucking hours about The Legend of Zelda, yet everyone couldn't give two shits about Mario. It's like, wow, remember that one time Mario rescued Princess Peach from Bowser because it's a fucking Mario game? I wonder if that connects the other time Mario had to rescue Princess Peach from Bowser because it's a fucking Mario game. I bet it's a prequel to that one time Mario went to space to rescue Princess Peach from Bowser because it's a fucking Mario game. You see, the Super Mario series is so blatantly serialized that no one really gives a shit. On a surface level, The Legend of Zelda is basically the same thing. But since the series isn't as shameless as the Super Mario series, there's this illusion that there's some kind of overarching storyline. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that Nintendo has always released sequels that aren't really sequels. This has always been the case ever since Zelda 1 and 2. The goal of The Legend of Zelda is to recover the Triforce of Wisdom, kill Ganon, and save Princess Zelda. In Zelda 2, a sleeping spell was cast on Princess Zelda, so Link has to acquire the Triforce of Courage in order to wake her up. But Ganon's minions are still attacking Link, because they can use his blood to bring Ganon back to life. Zelda 2 takes place a couple of years later with the same characters, but you don't have to play the first game to understand what's going on in the sequel. If you play the first game, you'll understand how Ganon died and the importance of the Triforce, but it's not really that necessary. If you happen to play Zelda 2 first, you already know that the Triforce is important because you have to save Princess Zelda, and you already know that Ganon is evil because you'll probably die a lot. The events of the previous game are simply used as a jumping off point to help set up new adventures, and every Zelda game that's a direct sequel works in the same exact way. The only continuity that the Zelda series has are the reoccurring characters and minor plot points that are mostly borrowed from previous entries. Sometimes they'll reuse an idea and expand on it for a sequel, sometimes they'll reuse an idea and slightly alter it to fit a specific narrative, but most of the time, each game expands on new bits of lore that haven't existed yet. While these bits of expanded lore fit within the narrative of its own game, it sometimes doesn't fit in with any of the previous entries in the series, because at that time, it just didn't exist. If every game in the Zelda timeline kept moving forward, this would probably not be an issue, but most of the time, Zelda games keep moving the timeline back and back and back, and sometimes even split off into completely alternate realities. Another minor problem with the continuity is that Nintendo likes to do a lot of fan service. This means that they will go to ridiculous lengths to include characters and references from previous games, even though it's kind of unnecessary. Nintendo will even lift enemy designs and characters from previous games and place them directly into other timelines where they shouldn't exist. Now, in a Mario game, no one's really going to give a shit, but for a Zelda game, the fans will desperately try to make connections to previous games that were never intended to be there. Now, this whole discussion up to this point has mostly been about why the Zelda timeline is completely meaningless, but that's only half the problem. The other major problem with the Zelda timeline is that it's really inconsistent. The foundation of the official Zelda timeline is based off of missing information that was filled in by the Hyrule Historia, but even with this new information, it still fails to make meaningful connections to every game in the series. The main problem with the Hyrule Historia is that it mostly explains the main events of each game without explaining the inconsistencies within the games themselves. To make matters worse, this entire section of the Hyrule Historia starts off by stating that the Zelda timeline isn't even set in stone. As it quotes, "The chronology of Hyrule is merely a collection of information that is believed to be true during the time. As the stories and storytellers of Hyrule change, so too does its history." So right off the bat, it's pretty clear that they realize that the official timeline is kind of bullshit. It's gonna be pretty difficult to explain my personal problems with the timeline if you're not familiar with the series. So for the sake of clarity, I'm not going to talk about my arguments with the timeline in its present form. After all, my problems with Skyward Sword aren't going to make sense if you don't know about the 15 games that were released before it. The best way to talk about the Zelda timeline is to take a trip back in time and try to piece it all together. So without wasting any more time, let's start at the beginning. Now, for all the dickless nerds out there, we need to forget that the Zelda timeline exists right now. None of these games have been released yet, we still got our dicks, and all we have right now is Zelda 1 and 2. The first Zelda game has Link trying to recover the Triforce of Wisdom in order to kill Ganon and save Princess Zelda. That's The Legend of Zelda in a nutshell. It's a pretty simple story that isn't too convoluted. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link is a sequel to this story, which takes place a couple of years later. Long ago, before the events of the first game, the King of Hyrule hid the Triforce of Courage in the Great Palace to keep it safe, and upon his death, he only told Princess Zelda the location of the Triforce. Long story short, a sleeping spell gets cast on Princess Zelda, and Link has to find the Triforce of Courage by going through 6 dungeons in order to wake her up. That's basically what happens in Zelda 2. It's a little weird considering that Link might have been able to find the Triforce of Courage in Zelda 1 in order to stop Ganon, but considering that Zelda was the only one who knew about the location of the Triforce of Courage, it at least makes sense. Clearly, the Triforce of Courage didn't exist until Zelda 2, but they at least give an explanation as to why Link wasn't able to find it in the first game. So now Nintendo releases The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and this is where this whole problem kind of started. The game starts by explaining that the Triforce resided in a hidden golden land, and a war broke out amongst people seeking the power of the Triforce. Evil power started to flow out of the golden land, so the King of Hyrule commanded 7 wise men to seal the gate to the land of the golden power. These events eventually became obscured by time and became legend. Many years later, peace remained in Hyrule until a mysterious wizard known as Aghanim Time decided to break the seal on the Golden Land. He eventually took control of the kingdom with his magic, and kidnapped the descendants of the 7 wise men in order to break the seal. Zelda, being the only remaining descendant, sends out a message to Link in order to be rescued, which kicks off the adventure for the game. Link ends up getting the Master Sword, travels to the Dark World, saves the descendants of the 7 wise men, and defeats Agnum and Ganon. Clearly, the events of A Link to the Past are pretty removed from Zelda 1 and 2, but it does give us an explanation about the origin of the Triforce. Apparently, the Triforce is located in the hidden Golden Land, which we now know as the Sacred Realm. But again, the Sacred Realm is a completely new concept that didn't exist in Zelda 1 and 2. You could say that this is a prequel to Zelda 1 and 2, because Zelda's message at the beginning of the game seems to imply they never met before, but again, it seems like it's completely disconnected. So now Nintendo releases The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, and this game is essentially a side story that is completely removed from the previous games. Basically, after Link defeated Ganon and saved Hyrule, he goes on a journey to train, but on his way back, the ship sinks and he washes up on the shores of Koholint Island. In order to get off the island, Link has to go to some dungeons in order to wake up the Windfish. I mean, talking about how much the Zelda timeline doesn't matter, these kinds of Zelda games really highlight how pointless these connections are. A lot of fans during the time said that this was a sequel to A Link to the Past, but honestly the connections between those two games are so loose that it could be a sequel to Zelda 1 and make just as much sense. If Link's Awakening was released later down the road, people would probably associate this game with a ton of other Zelda games, but since the connections between these two games are so loose, the release date is the only thing connecting these two games. Nintendo finally released The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and this is where things get pretty messy. This is the first game in the series to feature Ganondorf, the Gerudo who eventually became Ganon. Ocarina of Time borrows a ton of plot elements from A Link to the Past and tries to tell the story of how Ganondorf obtained the power of the Triforce. This seems like a really good connection for the Zelda timeline, except they decided to change one minor detail that ruins all of the continuity. In A Link to the Past, the prologue states that Ganondorf gets into the Sacred Realm and obtains the full power of the Triforce. He transforms into Ganon, fucks up the Sacred Realm, and the 7 wise men seal Ganon inside the Sacred Realm along with the Triforce. The ending of Ocarina of Time sets the stage for Ganondorf to be sealed in the Sacred Realm along with the Triforce, but they completely drop the ball. Ocarina of Time adds to the lore by stating that if one's heart is not in balance, Triforce will separate into 3 pieces: power, wisdom, and courage. Because of this minor addition, when Ganondorf enters the Sacred Realm to get to the Triforce, it instead splits off into 3 pieces, leaving Ganondorf with the Triforce of Power, which is the force that Ganondorf believed in the most. The later events of the game have Ganondorf seeking out the other 2 pieces, which were chosen by destiny to be given to Link and Zelda, and after a final battle, Ganondorf is sealed away with only the Triforce of Power. The problem now is that the whole concept of the Triforce splitting apart didn't exist until Ocarina of Time. In A Link to the Past, Ganondorf was able to use the power of the Triforce because it never split apart if someone's intentions were evil. This minor inconsistency wouldn't be that much of a problem, but considering Ocarina of Time lifted so many elements from A Link to the Past, it might as well be a fucking parallel universe at this point. Ocarina of Time literally rewrote the history of A Link to the Past, and god damn it, that is fucking frustrating. Now Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask as a sequel to Ocarina of Time. After Link killed Ganon, Zelda sent Link back in time to relive his own childhood, where the events of Majora's Mask take place. He travels to Termina, where he has to stop Skull Kid from destroying the entire world. It's a sequel with a pretty tight story that luckily doesn't ruin that much of the continuity. But let's not get too hopeful, because now Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons and The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages. In Oracle of Seasons, Link gets transported to Holodrum in order to save the Oracle Din by killing a Nox, and in Oracle of Ages, Link gets transported to Labrina in order to save the Oracle Nehru by killing Varon. It seems like these games are pretty harmless, but both of these games link together into one story through the use of passwords. The Link story shows the twin witches Twinrova attempting to resurrect the Demon King Ganon, and after beating both games, you can get the secret final ending where Link has to save Princess Zelda by defeating Ganon. It doesn't seem that harmless until you realize that Link already killed Twinrova in the events of Ocarina of Time, and since Ocarina of Time is literally the farthest back we've ever gotten, these characters shouldn't fucking be alive. It's a little easier to ignore if you just blow it off as fan service, but these characters literally affect the main plots of both of these games. They were the final boss fight in the last dungeon of Ocarina of Time. Now they're also the only reason that Ganon is revived in these games. Since the Oracle games lead into the events of Link's Awakening, this means that they have to take place after Ocarina of Time, which doesn't make any fucking sense. Now Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda Four Swords, which is a multiplayer Zelda game that feels completely removed from everything else, because it sets up all this lore that doesn't relate to anything at all. Basically, Vati escaped from a seal placed on the Four Sword and kidnapped Princess Zelda, and when Link draws the legendary sword, this splits Link into 4 different Links. Eventually, the 4 Links defeat Vati, rescue Princess Zelda, and reseal Vati in the Four Sword. Since almost all of its lore is completely removed from the previous games, and it's just a weird multiplayer Zelda game, most people kind of wrote this off as non-canon during the time. Then we got The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, and this is a turning point in which dickless nerds could finally annoy everyone else about the Zelda timeline. The Wind Waker is a sequel to Ocarina of Time, but probably in the most convoluted way possible. In Ocarina of Time, Link travels 7 years into the future so he can kill Ganondorf, but after he defeats him, Link is sent back to his childhood where Majora's Mask eventually takes place. The Wind Waker takes place after the events of Link killing Ganondorf. Many years after Link was sent back in time, Ganondorf eventually returned, but since Link has essentially vanished, there was no one left to stop him. This resulted in the gods flooding Hyrule, which eventually leads into the events of the Wind Waker. The Wind Waker did 2 very important things that allowed fans to actually care about the Zelda timeline. It established the fact that Link and Zelda are ancestors of Hylians that used to live in Hyrule, which means that every Zelda game could be different Links going on different adventures, and also created a canon timeline where the events of Ocarina of Time split off into 2 different timelines. The Wind Waker unintentionally allowed the entire series to feel a lot more consistent, but trying to connect all these games at this point is a complete waste of time. I mean, just look at this fucking mess. We have 2 Zelda games that work well with each other. We have a prequel to The Legend of Zelda that establishes the origins of the Triforce by creating the Sacred Realm that didn't really exist in the first 2 games. We have a side story that is so loosely connected it could be a sequel to Zelda 1, Link to the Past, or even fucking Ocarina of Time. We have a prequel to A Link to the Past that creates an origin for Ganon being sealed in the Sacred Realm that completely fucks up the continuity between those 2 games. We have one good sequel. We have a prequel side story to Link's Awakening that can only happen after Ocarina of Time that involves characters that were killed in Ocarina of Time. We have a completely random, maybe non-canon Zelda game that creates its own lore that's completely removed from everything else, and now we have a Zelda game that splits Ocarina of Time into 2 different timelines. Then we have these fucking dickless nerds trying to piece everything together, and it's like, fuck you! This is all bullshit and you know it! Before all this nonsense, Nintendo was doing just fine releasing every Zelda game as its own experience. The problem now is that Nintendo is still doing that. But now they're adding in all this half-assed, inconsistent continuity to every game. It's easy to understand on a surface level, but once you start digging into the smaller details, everything just falls apart. When people talk about the Zelda timeline, I'm honestly more frustrated by the fact that they're even bringing up the discussion in the first place. If you're passionate enough to have a discussion about the Zelda timeline, you should already know enough about the series to know that it's all fucking bullshit. Now, I don't really know what happened, but I feel like Nintendo was starting to feel the frustration. So they eventually released The Legend of Zelda Four Swords Adventures and The Legend of Zelda The Minish Cap. This basically fleshed out the Four Swords series, which is at least consistent within its own universe. The Minish Cap created an origin for the Four Sword and established Vati as the main villain of the series, and Four Swords Adventures was just another sequel to Four Swords. Then to completely fuck everything up again, Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. Twilight Princess is a sequel to Ocarina of Time once again, but this time it's a sequel to the events on the timeline that Majora's Mask takes place. The goal of Twilight Princess is for Link to prevent the Twilight Realm from consuming Hyrule by eventually killing Zant. The game sets up Zant to be the main antagonist, but they manage to shoehorn Ganondorf in at the very last second because it's fucking fan service. Basically, after Link was sent back in time to relive his childhood, Ganondorf ends up getting captured and sentenced to death. But since he has the Triforce of Power, they had to send him into the Twilight Realm. Now, this normally wouldn't be an issue if the events of Ocarina of Time were completely removed, but now that Ganondorf is in the game, none of these connections make sense. The Wind Waker was able to subvert this whole problem because the timeline takes place after adult Link killed Ganondorf, but now that Twilight Princess takes place after child Link was transported back in time, it creates creates more issues with the ending of Ocarina of Time. So before we even go into the problems of Twilight Princess, I need to explain how the time travel works in Ocarina of Time. In Ocarina of Time, the time travel wasn't perfect, but at least made some sense in the context of its own game. There are some minor inconsistencies with some of the gameplay mechanics, but overall, the main plot is relatively consistent. Basically, the timeline for Ocarina of Time can be broken down as such. There's the events of Child Link up until grabbing the Master Sword, there's a 7-year gap in which Link is trapped within the Sacred Realm, and there's the events of Adult Link up until he killed Ganondorf. This is the basic timeline of Ocarina of Time, but it gets a little more confusing once you start to involve Zelda and Ganondorf. The real turning point of the game is when Ganondorf is able to get into the Sacred Realm after Link has pulled the Master Sword from the pedestal. We can assume that he didn't get into the Sacred Realm at the very millisecond that Link pulled the sword from the pedestal, even if it was an infinitesimal amount of time. There was basically X amount of time until Ganondorf figured out the Sacred Realm was open and went inside. Once Ganondorf grabs the Triforce, it splits up into 3 different parts. He claims the Triforce of Power, Zelda is given the Triforce of Wisdom, and Link is given the Triforce of Courage. Ganondorf doesn't have the completed Triforce yet, but since Zelda has essentially fled Hyrule, and Link is trapped in the Sacred Realm for another 7 years, he can basically fuck everything up and take over Hyrule. Link eventually kills Ganondorf, he gets sent back in time, and now Ganondorf is no longer an issue because he can't gain access to the Sacred Realm. But of course, it's not that simple. The only problem is that another gameplay mechanic of Ocarina of Time is that Link can place the Master Sword back in the pedestal in order to go back in time to the point where he drew the sword from the pedestal. This is where things start to not make that much sense. If Link travels back in time to the point before he drew the Master Sword and opened the Sacred Realm, couldn't he just avoid all the problems of Ocarina of Time? I mean, he could just walk out of the Temple of Time, see how fucked up everything is, and just place the Master Sword back. After all, we can assume that it takes Ganondorf a certain amount of time to realize that the Sacred Realm is now open. If Link is able to place the Master Sword back in the pedestal and travel back in time before he opens the Sacred Realm, doesn't that mean that Ganondorf can't claim the power of the Triforce? Well, the game doesn't really explain any of this, but I feel like the implication was that Ganondorf still had the Triforce of Power even after Link travels back in time. This is my own interpretation of Ocarina of Time, but I feel like the Sacred Realm was supposed to be a kind of parallel world that isn't affected by the time travel. Essentially, once Ganondorf was able to get into the Sacred Realm and grabs the Triforce of Power, this action can't be undone by simply traveling back in time. From this point to the end of the game, Ganondorf will always have the Triforce of Power, Link will always have the Triforce of Courage, and Zelda will always have the Triforce of Wisdom. Sure, it's possible that Link does some more stuff as a child even after the point that Ganondorf gets into the Sacred Realm, but I always thought that the assumption was that Ganondorf was either preparing to take over Hyrule or that he was still looking for Princess Zelda. Once Ganondorf is finally defeated, he gets sealed away in the Sacred Realm with the Triforce of Power, which is why Ganondorf is no longer a threat at the end of the game. I mean, you can either assume that Ganondorf is sealed away in the Sacred Realm and thus removed from the timeline when Link travels back in time, or that Ganondorf is still alive but no longer has the Triforce of Power since it was sealed away. I'm not saying that it makes that much sense, but it's at least consistent throughout the entire game. The time travel kind of overcomplicates everything, but basically all that matters is that at some point, Ganondorf enters the Sacred Realm and claims the power of the Triforce, it splits apart into 3 different pieces, and then Ganondorf is ultimately sealed away along with the Triforce of Power. These interactions with the Sacred Realm can't be undone by traveling back in time. Otherwise, the entire storyline of Ocarina of Time basically falls apart. You could simplify it by still saying that Ganondorf can't gain access to the Sacred Realm at the end of the game, but again, that creates a giant plot hole where the entire game was a waste of time. So how does Twilight Princess fuck all this up? Well, the first major problem is that somehow Ganondorf still has the Triforce of Power even after all of the events of Ocarina of Time. If they cared at all about the continuity, Ganondorf wouldn't have the Triforce of Power, but since they wanted him to be a threat, they just gave it to him. By giving Ganondorf the Triforce of Power, this completely ruins the entire ending of Ocarina of Time. There are a couple of basic assumptions that you can make, but none of them involve Ganondorf still having the Triforce of Power. If Ganondorf is still alive at the end of the game with the Triforce Triforce of Power, the entire ending of Ocarina of Time doesn't make any sense. Zelda fled Hyrule Castle even before Ganondorf had the Triforce of Power, but now that Ganondorf is even more powerful than before, Zelda is suddenly back in the castle and everything is under control. Apparently Ganondorf is still just as powerful as he was at the end of the game, but Link just decides to leave to go to Termina? Twilight Princess seems to imply they were able to capture Ganondorf in order to execute him, but how the fuck did Ganondorf get captured alive while he has the fucking Triforce of Power? If Zelda and her guards approached Ganondorf and attempted to capture him, wouldn't he just transform into Ganon and fucking kill them? Did the developers not realize how fucking powerful Ganondorf is with just the Triforce of Power? The way it plays out in Twilight Princess, it seems to imply that Ganondorf didn't know he had the Triforce of Power up until he was executed. But how the fuck did he not know? Ganondorf was seeking out the power of the Triforce for the entirety of Ocarina of Time, and even had extensive knowledge of the Sacred Realm, but he hasn't realized he had the Triforce of Power up until his execution? Either Ganondorf is so oblivious to his own powers that it makes him look like a complete fool, or that he purposely got captured so he could enter the Twilight Realm in some kind of elaborate plan to take over Hyrule. It's most likely the latter, but it seems like Ganondorf never planned to get sealed away and just saw Zant as a means to getting what he wanted. I mean, how the fuck is Ganondorf going to know about the leaders of an alternate dimension before he's even entered it? I could question the logic of these connections for fucking hours, but it all comes down to the fact that they wanted Ganondorf in the game for fucking fan service, but realized he would have to have the Triforce of Power in order to be a threat. If you think of Twilight Princess as its own story, then all these events are much more believable, but connecting it directly to Ocarina of Time results in a ton of problems that could have been solved by just removing Ganondorf from the game. This isn't even going into the issue that the Twilight Realm did not exist until Twilight Princess was released. The game once again creates all of this lore surrounding the Twilight Realm that clearly never existed in Ocarina of Time, which is why these connections to previous games are so meaningless in the first place. I mean, how cool would it have been if we knew about the Twilight Realm back when A Link to the Past was released? Maybe you would hear about it from a couple of NPCs, you could drip feed information about the Twilight Realm over the course of a couple of games, and then when Twilight Princess is finally released, it would be this amazing reveal. Instead, it's just shoved in our faces, and suddenly all this lore that's never fucking existed before is suddenly in the Zelda universe. Don't get me wrong, I don't actually give a shit, but what's the point of connecting all of these games when Nintendo drastically changes the history of Hyrule for almost every single game? Now Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass and The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks. Phantom Hourglass is a direct sequel to The Wind Waker, and Spirit Tracks takes place 100 years later after Phantom Hourglass on a brand new continent. These games fit perfectly on the Zelda timeline as sequels to The Wind Waker, and they work fine as their own stories. They work well because there are sequels that don't fuck with the events of the previous games. So now we have a couple of games that connect with each other, but for the most part it's just a complete mess. At this point in time, the consensus between fans was that there was a linear timeline up until Ocarina of Time, with a timeline eventually split in Majora's Mask and The Wind Waker. There's essentially three clusters of Zelda games that have clear connections. You have the cluster that features the split in Ocarina of Time, you have the Four Swords series, and you have Zelda 1 and 2. Most people use these clusters as building blocks to help piece together the entire Zelda timeline, but as you can imagine, it's just a giant clusterfuck. Then out of nowhere, Nintendo's like, Skyward Sword's a prequel to fucking everything, and guess what, fucko? Here's the official timeline. Nintendo ripped its dick off, ran into the distance, never to be seen again. It's just like, what? What the fuck is this? Why did Nintendo officialize a fan theory? Maybe there's a couple of dickless nerds who are really excited about this, but I fucking wasn't. Before Nintendo released an official timeline, the fans who didn't really give a shit can just enjoy the games and not have to think about it. But now they've given ammunition to these fucking nerds. So every time Nintendo releases a new Zelda game from this point on, there's always going to be that discussion on where it falls on the Zelda timeline, even though it's all complete bullshit. The Zelda series was never supposed to have this much continuity, but I guess it doesn't matter anymore because they just made an official timeline. Now we're all stuck with whatever garbage Nintendo came up with. So now we finally come full circle. Does the Zelda timeline fix all the continuity problems and make the series feel consistent? Well, not really. Don't get me wrong, it's a miracle that a timeline was even created out of this mess. But again, it still doesn't fix that much. Before I even talk about Skyward Sword, let's talk about the problems that the Zelda timeline addressed. One of the only fixes to the Zelda timeline is the addition of the third timeline split at Ocarina of Time. It's a complete fucking cop-out in terms of piecing together the Zelda timeline, but by creating this third branch, it at least addresses the inconsistencies between A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. The main problem with this connection was that A Link to the the Past established that Ganon was sealed in the Sacred Realm with the completed Triforce, where Ocarina of Time ends with Ganondorf being sealed away with only the Triforce of Power. To try to address this, they created an alternate timeline in which Link dies in the final battle against Ganondorf. After Link dies, Ganondorf was able to piece together the completed Triforce and transform into Ganon, and Zelda and the sages were somehow able to seal away Ganondorf in the Sacred Realm. This makes sense if you don't really think about it, but the whole concept is kind of ridiculous. The Hyrule Historia seems to imply that Link dies in the first phase of the fight when he's fighting Ganondorf, but that doesn't make any sense. If Link dies to Ganondorf, then that means that Zelda is still trapped within the crystal. How the fuck does Zelda stop a fully powered Ganon with a completed Triforce when she's trapped in a fucking crystal? It does make more sense if Link dies during the second phase, when Ganondorf's already transformed into Ganon and Zelda is free from the crystal, but again, it's kind of a cop-out. It's a stupid explanation, but it does make logical sense, so I can't really fault it too hard. I just wish they attempted to maybe go further into detail so it didn't feel so forced. I mean, Jesus fucking Christ, you could have written more than 4 fucking sentences. One of the things that they didn't fix at all was the inconsistencies of Twilight Princess. The Hyrule Historia explains that Princess Zelda was informed by Link of what would happen in the future, so Ganondorf was eventually captured and brought to execution. It also explains how Ganondorf was able to have the Triforce of Power. Apparently, since Link brought back the Triforce of Courage when he traveled back in time, this caused the other 2 pieces to go directly to Zelda and Ganondorf. Because of this, Ganondorf wasn't able to go into the Sacred Realm to consolidate the power of the Triforce because the Triforce is already separated. While this explains how Ganondorf could have gotten the Triforce of Power, it doesn't really fix any of the issues that I talked about before. The Hyrule Historia fully explains that since Link has traveled back in time, Ganondorf wasn't able to go into the Sacred Realm to attain the power of the Triforce, which is fine. After all, that's basically the entire logic that makes the ending of Ocarina of Time make sense. The problem now is that apparently Link was able to bring back the Triforce of Courage? Doesn't that ruin the entire continuity of the Wind Waker? If Link was able to bring back the Triforce of Courage, shouldn't that piece of the Triforce essentially be removed from that timeline? Apparently Link was able to take the Triforce of Courage when he traveled back in time, but he was also able to leave it behind for the Wind Waker. Link can't do both of these things. If Link is possibly leaving behind his piece of the Triforce, did the gods decide to give Link his piece of the Triforce back in his timeline because he used to have it? That kind of makes sense, but then why the fuck would the gods choose to give Ganondorf the Triforce of Power? Even if we go with this logic, it still begs the question of why Ganondorf gets his piece of the Triforce when he was sealed away in the Sacred Realm. Apparently Ganondorf was sealed away along with the Triforce of Power in the Majora's Mask section, but now the Hyrule Historia is contradicting the writing in its own fucking book. Apparently Zelda gave Link the Ocarina of Time and told Link to travel far away so Ganondorf couldn't get into the Sacred Realm, but does that even matter anymore? Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf already have their pieces of the Triforce, so why does the Sacred Realm even matter at this point? If Ganondorf enters the Sacred Realm, wouldn't there just be nothing there? Why would Ganondorf want to go into the Sacred Realm when the only thing he wants is the completed Triforce? I guess if Link leaves, it would make it harder for Ganondorf to get his piece of the Triforce, but he could still completely fuck up Hyrule with just the Triforce of Power alone. What the fuck is Zelda going to do by herself? He could just put that bitch in a fucking crystal and he's basically already won. The Hyrule Historia explains that Link travels back in time to the point where Zelda is still looking at Ganondorf in the window, but that doesn't make any sense. If Zelda gave Link the Ocarina of Time, doesn't that imply that the door of time hasn't been opened yet? Clearly it has to be open, because how the fuck did Link leave the Temple of Time? When Link gets transported back in time, does that mean he's just stuck behind the door of time forever? If Ganondorf is behind that window, doesn't that mean that all 3 pieces of the Triforce are within the same vicinity? Wouldn't this cause the Triforce to form back to its original state and probably result in Ganondorf getting the completed Triforce? Clearly, the implication that Ocarina of Time set before all this nonsense was that Link traveled back in time to the point before he pulled the Master Sword out of the pedestal. The ending implies that Ganondorf is no longer a threat, which is why Zelda has returned to the castle, and the only reason Zelda's just standing there is because you only visit her once in the game, and they were too lazy to make her do anything else. This is just the limitations of the Nintendo 64, but the Hyrule Historia seems to believe that since Zelda is standing in this spot, it has to be the same time when they first met, but clearly that can't be the case because the door of time is fucking open. They just gave Ganondorf the Triforce of Power and Twilight Princess because of fucking fan service, and now the Hyrule Historia can't give a good reason without fucking everything up. Besides the obvious problems with the connections to Ocarina of Time, the rest of the Zelda timeline doesn't have too many major problems, mostly because all these connections are just meaningless to begin with. Sure, the fan service fucks up the continuity for a ton of other games, but like I said before, it's just Nintendo recycling old ideas and not giving a shit. Now that we finally got all that out of the way, let's talk about Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword begins at the very start of the Zelda timeline. In the beginning, 3 goddesses created the world. Din, the goddess of power, created the land, Nehru, the goddess of wisdom, created order, and Faror, the goddess of courage, created life. The goddesses then departed to the heavens, leaving behind the Triforce in the very spot where they left, where its resting spot became the Sacred Realm. Now, we already knew this from Ocarina of Time, but Skyward Sword adds to the lore by just changing it. The way it plays out in Skyward Sword, it seems to imply that the Triforce was actually just on the surface and not in the Sacred Realm. In fact, Skyward Sword seems to imply that the Sacred Realm never existed. Anyways, the Golden Goddesses departed from the world and left the Triforce in the care of the goddess Hylia. Who the fuck is the goddess Hylia? Well, it's something that Skyward Sword made up. So now the Triforce is on the surface and not in the Sacred Realm, and also there's this goddess that's protecting it who's never existed up until Skyward Sword was released. Eventually, the Demon King Demise tries to take over the world. So after a long battle, the goddess Hylia gathered the humans and the Triforce on a plot of land and sent it towards the sky. The battle continued until the goddess and the remaining tribes on the surface were able to seal Demise away. Now the land was saved, but the seal against Demise was starting to weaken. The goddess Hylia attempted to destroy Demise with the power of the Triforce, but since a goddess can't wield its powers, she decided to strip her divinity and be reborn as a human. This is the point where Skyward Sword's story begins. All that really matters is that Link and Zelda live on a floating rock. Zelda falls off, Link goes to save Zelda and kill Demise, and Link and Zelda start a new life on the surface. I don't really have a problem with the story of Skyward Sword because the story is fine enough and doesn't ruin that much of the continuity. The only problem I have with Skyward Sword is that all the lore that it created is kind of meaningless. The most frustrating thing about this lore is that it's explaining things that never had to be explained. There's a lot to talk about, but let's start with Zelda herself. It's important to remember that the only goal of Skyward Sword was to piece together the timeline. So when they were creating an origin for Zelda, they had to create something that's broad enough so it could apply to every Zelda game. Skyward Sword gives an origin for Zelda by explaining that she's the human reincarnation of the goddess Hylia. The only reason this lore exists is to basically explain why Zelda has magical powers. But did that really have to be explained? Well, no, it didn't, but the goal of Skyward Sword was to create the timeline. So since this explanation is so vague, you can pretty much apply this lore to every Zelda game. It's kind of frustrating because this lore is just an excuse to create continuity that was clearly never meant to be there. In Zelda 1 and 2, Zelda is just a regular girl who has no magical powers, but since she's the princess, she has access to the Triforce of Wisdom. Back in the day, the Triforce of Wisdom was just a physical object that gave you power. The royal family didn't possess any magical abilities, but they used the magic of the Triforce to maintain order. In the later games, Zelda is a descendant of the 7 sages. Her connections to the royal family means that she possesses magical abilities from her lineage, but ultimately, most of her power relies on the use of the Triforce of Wisdom. The Triforce in these games is more related to the gods. It was a relic that was left by the 3 goddesses after they created the world, where its resting point is the Sacred Realm. In the 4 Swords series, Zelda only gets her power from the Light Force, a source of infinite power that is passed down from her lineage, and the Triforce doesn't even matter in this series. This is kinda why the Zelda timeline is bullshit. All that Skyward Sword does is attempt to connect things that were never meant to. Now in Zelda 1, she used to be the goddess Hylia. In Ocarina of Time, she used to be the goddess Hylia. In 4 Swords, she used to be the goddess Hylia. It's frustrating because the goddess Hylia doesn't fucking exist in these games. Why does everything have to connect? Why can't these games just be separate stories? These games were perfectly fine, but now Skyward Sword has to create this blanket statement just for the sake of creating a shitty timeline. One of the worst things about Skyward Sword is the lore surrounding Demise. Who the fuck is Demise? Well, apparently it's Ganondorf. I mean, since Ganondorf and Ganon appear in so many games, they have to explain how that's possible. They literally pull this bullshit that states that some kind of never-ending cycle of reincarnation, when in reality it's just Nintendo doing fan service because they didn't give a shit. I understand why they did it, but who fucking cares? Whoop-de fucking dude, you know that Ganon's been the main villain for the entire fucking series? Wow, never knew that. Once again, Skyward Sword is just creating continuity for the sake of making a shitty timeline. In Zelda 1, Ganon was just fucking Bowser. He was some dopey looking pig monster who's trying to take over Hyrule, and there's nothing special about him. In Zelda 2, Ganon is dead, but his minions are trying to bring him back to life by using Link's blood. He can be revived because it's fucking magic. It's not this never-ending cycle of reincarnation or whatever bullshit thing Skyward Sword came up with. In the later Zelda games, Ganon used to be a Gerudo who just happened to get a hold of the Triforce of Power. He was just some normal guy who was a fucking asshole, and he just wanted the ultimate power of the gods. The only reason he appeared in multiple games was because he was holding on to this power that didn't belong to him. In the Four Swords series, Ganondorf was just a normal Gerudo who trespassed into an ancient pyramid and stole the trident. He used the dark power of the trident to eventually steal the dark mirror and free Vati from his seal. Again, the Triforce plays no role in this story at all. Ganondorf was just a power-hungry asshole who wanted to take over Hyrule by whatever means necessary. Of course, when creating a timeline, there's no possible way to explain how Ganon appears in all these games, so Skyward Sword has to come up with some bullshit, never-ending cycle of reincarnation to connect these games that were never meant to connect. In Zelda 1, Ganon was Demise. In Ocarina of Time, Ganon was Demise. In Four Swords, Ganon was Demise. That's right, all these amazing versions of Ganon were just this character that you never heard about until just now. Does anyone realize how fucking stupid this is? It makes sense if you're trying to make some shitty timeline, but does anyone really give a shit? Was this a question that really needed to be answered? Did we really need some detailed explanation that tells us why Ganon was a bad guy? Who fucking cares? They even created this entire origin for the Master Sword too, except all that really happens is that the Goddess Sword just magically turns into the Master Sword out of fucking nowhere. I mean, they could have at least done something interesting with it. Maybe you could have had an early boss fight where the Goddess Sword does absolutely no damage to Demise, and there could have been this whole section of the game where you'd have to design a weapon that could specifically kill him. You could have traveled to 3 more dungeons to get materials required to craft the Master Sword, and then by the end of the game, it would actually hold some more weight. Then it would make sense why the Master Sword was used to defeat Ganon, because it would have been the sword that was designed to specifically kill Demise. Yeah, but fuck that. Let's just make it so Fi was in the Master Sword the whole time. That's right, this character that you'd never heard about until right now has been in the Master Sword this whole time. God, I fucking hate this game. For whatever reason, the Master Sword has become this legendary tool that's always required to eradicate evil, when it's clearly never existed in Zelda 1 and the Four Swords series. In Zelda 1, all that mattered was the power of the Triforce. You could use whatever bullshit sword you want, but as long as you wield the power of the Triforce, that's all you need to oppose someone else with the same power. I mean, for the love of God, Link uses the power of the Triforce of Wisdom to defeat Ganon. In A Link to the Past, Ganon had the power of the completed Triforce, so clearly Link needed something else to match that power, which is why the Master Sword was a required tool in A Link to the Past. It was a magical sword that could defeat Ganon, and it never needed to have an elaborate backstory to explain why. Things were a lot simpler back then. You didn't need some 10-minute long cutscene that explains why the Master Sword is important. You just say this sword can kill anything because it's fucking magic. Who gives a shit? In the later Zelda games, the Master Sword is apparently as useful as it was in A Link to the Past, but it's not really that necessary, considering the fact that Link always has the Triforce of Courage. So in order for it to be useful, they've always tied the Master Sword to some kind of gimmick. The Master Sword doesn't have to be there, but let's just do some fucking fan service because people like the Master Sword. In the Four Swords series, the Master Sword doesn't fucking exist at all, considering the only thing that matters is the Four Sword. So now Skyward Sword establishes that Link needs to have the Master Sword to defeat Demise, while also ignoring the fact that he never needed it in Zelda 1 and Four Swords Adventures, which are all at the very end of the timeline featuring the reincarnations of Demise. It's almost like these games were never meant to connect like this. Now, I don't want to shit on Skyward Sword forever because that would just be missing the whole point of this discussion. The only reason I'm so frustrated by the timeline is because the timeline shouldn't even exist. Skyward Sword was an attempt to fix the continuity of the series, but what's wrong with the series not having continuity? Why are we acting like this is a bad thing? I mean, how amazing is it that anyone right now can play any game in the series and just enjoy it? That's the reason why the Zelda series is so timeless. You don't have to play these games in a very specific order to understand what's going on, so why is this even an issue? Whatever. Fuck that. We need to figure out what order these games go in because I have no fucking dick. If Skyward Sword is a prequel to Ocarina of Time, is Gaepora the owl from Ocarina of Time? If Gaepora is the owl, how does Rauru fit into all this? Did Gaepora help Rauru build the Temple of Time? I mean, I played Ocarina of Time, but how did the Temple of Time get there? I mean, when you play the Ocarina of Time, to open the Door of Time, how does that work? Does the door detect the sounds of the Ocarina of Time? What mechanical equipment causes the Door of Time to open? I mean, once you go inside, there's a window right there. Why couldn't Link just get a ladder and break through the window? Clearly, Rauru needed to hire specific contractors to make magical stone bricks that could resist outside forces. Who fucking gives a shit? Shut the fuck up! Who'd win in a fight, Goku or Deadpool? What color lightsaber would you have? No one gives a fuck! God! What a fucking waste of time! Fuck off! Fuck you! Now at this point, none of these new Zelda games are featured in the Hyrule Historia, but they're not that hard to figure out. The first two games released after the official timeline came out was The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds and The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes. These are handheld games, so they don't fuck with the continuity as much as the console entries. Basically, A Link Between Worlds is a reimagining of A Link to the Past that takes place hundreds of years later, so it basically takes place after Link's awakening. Triforce Heroes features the same Link from A Link Between Worlds, which features its own little side story in Hytopia, so it's just a sequel to A Link Between Worlds. That wasn't too bad, but let's not get too hopeful. Then Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and this is what really drove me off the edge. I honestly think that Nintendo has dropped the Zelda timeline entirely, because Breath of the Wild does not give a fuck. Looking at this game objectively, the main story seems to imply that this game takes place after Twilight Princess. There's a ton of fan service you have to sift through, but the main story itself seems to reference Twilight Princess, Ocarina of Time, and Skyward Sword the most. This wouldn't be an issue, but the problem now is that Breath of the Wild also has the Rito and the Koroks from the Wind Waker, which takes place in a separate timeline. The Kokiri and the Zoras in Ocarina of Time evolved into the Koroks and the Rito after Hyrule was flooded in the Wind Waker, which is why their inclusion literally makes no sense. The only reason these races evolved in the first place was because of an event that doesn't take place in this timeline. Just to add to the confusion, there are also Zoras in the game as well, which is why I think Nintendo clearly doesn't give a shit. Don't get me wrong, I don't care either. The frustration I've been feeling recently has mostly been from these dickless nerds. They'll see the Temple of Time and Lon Lon Ranch and make all these speculations on where this game fits on the Zelda timeline. But then when you point out this obvious continuity error, they'll just say, well, it makes more sense if you just ignore it. And it's like, fuck you! You can't talk about the Zelda timeline and just ignore the things that don't make sense! Maybe you find it fun to create fan theories, and that's fine. You can do whatever you want. All I'm saying is that you're wasting your time. Nintendo will never do anything with this timeline. Maybe you can assume that they're going to fill in all the gaps with future Zelda games, but all they've proven so far is that they do not give a fuck. After all, why would Nintendo care about the Zelda timeline when all it does is limit their creativity? If you've read the Hyrule Historia, you might have seen that the series producer, Eiji Aonuma, actually addresses this. He says that one of the first questions that the developers ask before starting on a game is what kind of gameplay should we focus on, rather than what kind of story should we write. Because of the way the series is designed, you could say that the stories of each game are mere afterthoughts. Aonuma fully admits that there are a few inconsistencies within the Zelda timeline, but he hopes that the fans will be broad-minded enough to take into consideration that this is simply how Zelda is made. And you know what? I completely understand. But considering that this is how The Legend of Zelda was made, maybe you shouldn't have made the fucking timeline. I've pretty much known this from the very start, but now that this timeline exists, we have these dumb fuck dickless nerds who clearly don't see it that way. It's not really that big of a deal, but it's just kind of annoying. I guess if there was any takeaway from this video, it's that this entire discussion is a giant waste of time. If you want to talk about your personal fan theories, then I don't really give a shit, but let's stop pretending the official Zelda timeline actually matters. Sure, the Zelda timeline creates a ton of problems, but these problems only exist if you think that the timeline is important. At the end of the day, the Zelda timeline has always been a fan theory that someone just made up. There's no point in getting upset at Nintendo for poorly implementing some stupid fan theory that was created by some dipshit kid on GameFAQs. Sure, there's an official timeline now, but just remember that this timeline didn't exist for about 25 years. Nintendo thought they could tie the series together after making 15 games, but they failed, and now they don't give a shit. Anyways, this entire video was fucking pointless, and hopefully someone out there found this slightly entertaining. Hopefully when the next Zelda game is released and we all have that inevitable discussion on where it fits on the Zelda timeline, just realize that the only people who still care about it are dickless nerds who are too stupid to realize that Nintendo doesn't even give a shit.